It was raining hard that night. The kind of rain that pounds on the roof, relentless, like it's trying to warn you of something coming. I never liked driving in storms, but he was calm, reassuring me with that half-smile he wore, one that always made me feel safe. And so I let myself relax, trusting him, trusting the night, believing that whatever came, we'd face it together. We'd been at a friend's party, celebrating, laughing, one of those rare nights where everything felt easy. It was just us on the road, the rain blurring the lights of the city around us, turning everything into this quiet, hidden world that was only ours. We talked about the future, about things we wanted, dreams we shared. He seemed so genuine, so present, his hand resting comfortably on the wheel, as if there was nowhere he'd rather be. But then, everything changed in an instant. The car swerved, a blinding flash of lights, the shudder of metal twisting, the darkness that closed in, as I felt myself thrown into something hard, my body jolting as the world turned upside down. I don't know how long it was before I opened my eyes, but when I did, everything was cold. The rain had found its way through shattered glass, soaking me, numbing the pain, but never enough to make it go away completely. I tried to move, to turn my head, but my body screamed in protest, and then through the haze, I heard his voice. Relief washed over me. He was there. I wasn't alone. But as I listened, the warmth faded. He wasn't calling my name, he was calling for someone else. And then I heard it. Her name. His ex. For a moment, my mind couldn't process it. I thought maybe I was imagining things, that it was the pain playing tricks on me. But then I saw him, his shadow moving in the rain, his hands reaching out. Not for me, not for the woman he claimed to love, but for her. She was barely conscious, her form tangled in the wreckage, and yet he cradled her. Whispered reassurances to her, words that I thought were meant for me. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the rain, by the hollow ache that filled my chest as I watched him hold her. There was nothing for me. No touch, no words, no reassurance. Just silence. A silence that screamed louder than any words could. I lay there, the rain mixing with the tears I couldn't stop, and realized, in that moment, how little I mattered. They say that in times of crisis, you see a person's true self. I always thought he was the one person who would stand by me, who would choose me when it mattered. But as I watched him hold her, his ex, like she was his entire world, I felt something inside me break. He had made his choice, and it wasn't me. It wasn't the first time I'd been left behind. I think in some ways, I'd been preparing for this moment my entire life, though I never realized it. Growing up, I was always the one to make sacrifices, to step aside so others could have what they wanted. It was like a role I'd been born into, something I never questioned. My parents always seemed to favor my sister Emily. She was the golden child, the one with all the talents, the one they pinned their hopes on. I was just there, the quiet one, the one who learned to be content with the scraps of attention that came my way. Every time Emily had a recital or an award ceremony, my parents were there, cheering her on, supporting her dreams. And every time, I'd sit on the sidelines, clapping quietly, pretending that it didn't hurt. There was one night in particular that I still remember, clear as if it happened yesterday. I was 15, and I'd been working on a painting for months. A project for school, something I'd poured my heart into. It was the first time I felt proud of something I'd done, like maybe I was good at something too. But that same night, Emily had a dance recital, and my parents, of course, chose to go there. They never even saw my painting. I remember standing alone in that empty gallery, the lights dimming as everyone left, feeling so small, so invisible. And I think, maybe from that moment on, I learned that I couldn't count on anyone to choose me. It was a hard lesson, one I thought I'd come to terms with. But that night in the rain, watching him cradle her, that old wound ripped open, fresh and raw, as if it had never healed at all. I'd told myself that he was different. That with him, I didn't have to fight to be seen, to be valued. I had believed, foolishly, that I was enough. I'd grown up telling myself that if I could just be patient, if I could just make myself good enough, eventually someone would choose me. Eventually, someone would see me, value me, love me in the way I'd always longed for. So when he came into my life, with that gentle smile, with those words that felt like warmth wrapping around me, I really thought, he was the one I'd been waiting for. I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me, not just as a placeholder, not just as a convenient option, but as someone who truly mattered. In the beginning, it was beautiful. He seemed so different from anyone I'd known. He listened, he asked questions. He made me feel like I was important, like my thoughts, my dreams, my fears were worth something. It was the first time I'd felt that kind of attention, that kind of validation. And maybe that's why I fell so hard. I'd spent my whole life feeling like I was invisible, and then suddenly, there was this person who made me feel seen. But now, looking back, I wonder how much of it was real. How much of it was genuine. Were those words he spoke to me born out of love? Or were they just something convenient, something that kept me around while he still carried a torch for someone else? I think, deep down, I'd always felt a shadow hanging over our relationship. It was something unspoken, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was there, lingering in the background. Every now and then, he'd mention her, his ex, just in passing. A comment here, a memory there. And every time he did, there was a flicker in his eyes, a softness that I never saw when he talked about me. I'd brush it off, tell myself I was being paranoid, insecure. But the truth was, I could never quite shake the feeling that part of him was still with her, that a piece of his heart had never really let her go. There were moments, little signs that seemed so small, so insignificant, but now they feel like clues I should have paid attention to. Like the way he'd get quiet when her name came up, the way his eyes would drift, like he was somewhere else, remembering something I wasn't a part of. Or the way he'd sometimes pull away, distant, as if there was a part of himself he was keeping hidden, a part that didn't belong to me. I remember one night in particular. It was our anniversary. I'd gone out of my way to plan everything perfectly, wanting to make it special, wanting to show him how much he meant to me. I'd cooked his favorite dinner, set up candles, the whole cliché thing. I was so nervous, so eager to see his reaction. And for a while, everything was perfect. He smiled, he laughed, he held my hand, telling me how lucky he was to have me. But then, halfway through the evening, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and in that moment, something shifted. I saw the name flash across the screen. Her name. His face softened, his hand slipping from mine, his gaze drifting away as he read the message. It was like I wasn't even there. I tried to brush it off, to pretend I didn't notice, but the rest of the night felt hollow, like a celebration meant for someone else. And maybe that's when the doubt began to creep in, small at first, barely noticeable, but growing over time, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. I kept telling myself it was just my insecurities, that I needed to trust him, that he was with me now, not her. But in my heart, I could feel it. The quiet, gnawing suspicion that I would never truly have all of him, that part of him would always belong to her. And that's what makes the betrayal cut so deep. It's not just about the choice he made that night in the rain, the choice to save her while leaving me behind. It's about every moment that led up to it, every instance where he chose her, where he kept her in his heart. Even when I was right there, willing to give him everything. I gave him all of me, believing that it was enough. But now I see that it never was. That I was just filling a space, a temporary substitute for a love he couldn't let go of. As I lay there, helpless in the rain, watching him hold her, I realized that I'd spent so much of my life trying to be enough for people who would never truly see me. My parents, my friends, him. I was always the one who waited, the one who gave, the one who believed that if I just tried hard enough, maybe one day, I'd be chosen. But that night, with the rain pouring down, and his voice soft as he whispered to her, I knew that day would never come. The realization settled into me, heavy and cold, a weight I could feel in my bones. I was alone, truly alone, and there was no one who would save me. I had to save myself. There's a strange clarity that comes with heartbreak, a kind of sharp, painful clarity that cuts through all the illusions, all the dreams you wrapped around yourself to feel safe. Lying there in the cold rain, with the weight of his betrayal pressing down on me, I felt something inside me shift. It was subtle at first, like a small crack forming in a wall that's held strong for too long. But as I lay there, feeling the ache in my bones, the emptiness in my chest, that crack began to widen, and I felt a flood of emotions I hadn't let myself feel before. For so long, I'd been surviving on hope, on the belief that love meant sacrifice, that if you cared for someone enough, they would eventually see you, value you. But that night, as I watched him with her, as I felt the raw pain of his choice, I knew that hope had been my biggest mistake. I had clung to it, let it guide me, allowed it to convince me that my worth was tied to the way he looked at me, the way he treated me. But in that moment, as I lay broken and forgotten, I realized something. I deserved more. I deserved to be someone's first choice. Not just an option, not just a placeholder, while they waited for something better. I deserved love that wasn't built on my silence, my sacrifices, my willingness to endure. For the first time in my life, I let myself feel the anger. I let it fill me, burn through every corner of my heart, pushing aside the pain, the sadness, the heartbreak. It was a quiet anger, steady and fierce, not the kind that makes you lash out, but the kind that settles deep within you, grounding you, giving you strength. I could feel it growing, like a fire that had been smoldering for years, finally allowed to breathe. I thought about every moment I had spent trying to be what he needed, trying to fit into his life, trying to become someone worthy of love. I thought about the times I'd set aside my own dreams, my own desires, just to make him happy, just to feel like I was enough. And then I thought about the truth, the cold, harsh truth that had been staring me in the face all along. No amount of sacrifice would ever make me enough for someone who had already made up their mind. There was one day, early in our relationship, when I'd gotten sick, really sick. I was in bed for days, feverish, weak, barely able to move. He came to see me, brought soup, sat by my side, but he was distracted. I remember watching him, seeing the way he kept checking his phone, the way he seemed restless, as if he wanted to be somewhere else. I brushed it off at the time, told myself he was just busy, that I was lucky he was there at all. But now, as I thought back on it, I could see it clearly. He had never really been there, not in the way I needed him to be. He was always halfway out the door, one foot still lingering in the past, in a life that didn't include me. And I had convinced myself that I could change that I could be enough to make him stay. But that night in the rain, something broke inside me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep giving pieces of myself to people who would never value them. I had spent so much time being someone's second choice, someone's fallback option, but I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep sacrificing my happiness, my dreams, my self-worth, just to fit into someone else's life. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my decision settle into me. It was terrifying, the thought of letting go, of stepping away from everything I had held on to, everything I had thought defined me. But I also felt a strange sense of peace, a calmness that came from finally seeing things for what they were, from finally choosing myself over someone who would never choose me. As the rain continued to fall, washing away the tears, the hurt, the remnants of the person I used to be, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would never let anyone make me feel invisible again, that I would never allow myself to become a background character in my own life. I was done waiting, done hoping, done sacrificing. I didn't know exactly what the future held, didn't know what steps I would take next, but I knew one thing for certain. I was going to rebuild, piece by piece, not for anyone else but for myself. I was going to find strength in the very things that had once made me feel weak. The quiet endurance, the patience, the willingness to believe in love. I was going to take those parts of myself and turn them into something powerful, something that no one could take away from me. As I sat there, drenched and alone, I knew it was the beginning of something new, something that wouldn't be defined by someone else's choices, someone else's love. I was finally free. Free from the illusions, the lies, the endless cycle of hoping for something that would never come. And in that freedom, I found a strength I had never known, a strength that came from finally choosing myself. It's funny, the things that go through your mind when you've reached the end of something. As I sat there, feeling the weight of everything I'd endured, I realized just how much of myself I'd lost, trying to hold on to something that was never really mine. And in that moment, I knew that the only way forward was to let go, to release every last piece of the life I'd built around him. I had to leave him behind, not out of anger, but because I was finally ready to choose myself. The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. Every time I thought about confronting him, about standing up for myself, the fear crept back in, whispering that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I should just move on quietly, let him go without causing a scene. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence had been my cage. I'd spent years letting others dictate my worth, letting their choices determine my happiness, and it was time to break free. So I made a decision. I would confront him, not for him, but for me. I needed to see him, to say the words I'd been holding in, to let him know that I was done being invisible, done being the quiet one who just accepted whatever was thrown at her. I didn't need closure from him. I needed closure from the version of myself that had stayed small, quiet, compliant. This confrontation was my chance to take back my voice. I met him at the same cafe where we'd had our first date, where he'd looked at me with those eyes that had once made me feel so seen, so cherished. But today, those eyes held no power over me. Today I saw him for what he truly was, a man who would never value me, who would always put his past ahead of our future. And as he sat across from me, oblivious to what was coming, I felt a surge of strength that made me sit up straighter, my voice steady and calm. "Do you remember that night?" I began, my voice slicing through the quiet hum of the cafe. "The night of the accident when you left me in the rain?" His face changed, a flicker of something that looked like guilt crossing his eyes. But I didn't stop, didn't give him a chance to explain, to make excuses. "I watched you, you know? I watched you hold her, comfort her, while I lay there, wondering if I would survive. I kept thinking that maybe, just maybe, you'd come back for me. But you didn't. You left me there alone, and in that moment I realized that I was nothing more than an afterthought to you." He tried to speak, to offer some explanation, but I raised my hand, silencing him. This was my moment, my time to be heard, and I wasn't going to let him take it from me. "I'm done waiting for you to see me, to value me, to love me the way I deserve. I'm done sacrificing my happiness, my worth, just to fit into a life that you clearly never wanted me in. I've spent too long being invisible, but that ends today. I deserve more than this. I deserve more than you." The words felt like a release, a weight lifting from my chest as I spoke them aloud. I watched him, saw the shock, the shame flicker across his face, but it didn't affect me. In that moment, I was free. Free from the need for his validation, free from the silent desperation that had kept me clinging to a relationship that was built on lies. As I stood up, I looked at him one last time, feeling nothing but a quiet sense of relief. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't hurt. I was simply done. And as I walked out of that cafe, leaving him and all the years of heartbreak behind, I felt a strength I'd never known, a power that came from finally choosing myself over someone who had never chosen me. Walking away from him, from everything we'd built, felt like stepping into an unknown world. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was no longer the girl who waited, who sacrificed, who believed that love was something you had to earn. I was someone new, someone strong, someone who understood that my worth wasn't tied to anyone's choices but my own. And as I moved forward, leaving the pieces of my old life behind, I knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. I was no longer bound by the past, no longer defined by the heartbreak, the betrayal, the endless waiting. I was free to create a life that was mine, a life that didn't revolve around someone else's love, someone else's choices. They say that when you hit rock bottom, you're given a choice, to stay there or to rise. And that day, I chose to rise. I chose to take every piece of pain, every tear, every sacrifice, and turn it into strength, into a foundation for a life that was built on my own terms. I may not have had all the answers, may not have known what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never again give someone else the power to determine my worth. I would never again allow myself to become invisible. I was finally free. And in that freedom, I found myself. Walking away from him that day felt like leaving behind a version of myself that no longer served me. There was no sadness, no regret, only a calmness, a peace that settled in my chest, filling the spaces where hurt and disappointment had once lived. It was a feeling I couldn't remember ever having before, a quiet strength that whispered, "You're free." The days that followed were filled with moments of clarity. I looked back on the years I'd spent trying to prove my worth, trying to be seen, to be chosen, and I felt a strange sense of compassion for that girl I once was. She had given everything, sacrificed so much, all for the hope that someone would love her enough to stay. And while it broke my heart to realize how long I'd waited in vain, I also felt proud of her resilience, her willingness to love so deeply. But now, I knew that love wasn't something you earned by giving pieces of yourself away. Real love, true love, was something that lifted you, that made you feel seen, valued, cherished. I began to rebuild, piece by piece, a life that was mine alone. I filled my days with things I'd once set aside, passions I'd abandoned in the pursuit of someone else's happiness. I went back to painting, letting colors and shapes express the emotions that words couldn't capture. I found joy in the simplest things: quiet mornings with a cup of tea, long walks through the city, moments of stillness where I could hear my own thoughts, my own dreams, without the weight of someone else's expectations. And as I built this new life, I discovered something unexpected. A sense of self that was stronger, more resilient than I'd ever known. I no longer needed validation from anyone else to feel worthy. My happiness, my peace, were things I could create for myself, things no one could take away from me. There were still moments when memories of him would surface, moments when I'd remember the times we shared, the laughter, the whispered promises. But those memories no longer held power over me. They were just fragments of a past that I had outgrown, reminders of a lesson I had learned the hard way. And I held no bitterness, no anger. In some strange way, I felt grateful for the experience, for the heartbreak, for the betrayal. It had broken me, yes, but it had also rebuilt me into someone stronger, someone who understood her worth, someone who would never settle for less again. In time, I found myself opening up to new relationships, friendships that were built on mutual respect, on a genuine appreciation for each other's individuality. I learned to let people in, but this time, it was different. I didn't seek validation. I didn't need anyone to complete me. I was whole on my own, and the connections I made were simply additions to a life that was already fulfilling. One afternoon, months after that day in the cafe, I found myself sitting in a park, watching the world go by. The sun was warm, casting a golden light over everything, and I felt a deep sense of contentment settle over me. It was a peace that came not from another person, not from validation or approval, but from within. I had made it through the storm, had faced the darkest parts of myself, and come out the other side, stronger and more whole than I'd ever been. I thought about the journey, the pain, the moments of doubt, and I realized that every single experience had brought me to this moment. Every heartbreak, every sacrifice, every silent tear, they had shaped me, molded me into someone who could stand on her own, someone who could look back and say, I made it. I was no longer the girl who waited to be chosen. I was a woman who had chosen herself, who had built a life of meaning, of purpose, of love. Love for herself, love for the life she had created. I looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and I knew that I was finally free. Free from the need to prove myself, free from the shadows of the past, free to live a life that was mine, fully and completely. I had found my voice, my strength, my worth, and no one could ever take that away from me. As I sat there, breathing in the quiet peace of that moment, I felt a smile spread across my face. I was ready to embrace whatever the future held, ready to live a life that was filled with joy, with purpose, with a love that came from within. I had survived, I had healed, and now I was finally whole. I may have been left behind once, but I would never leave myself behind again. This was my life, my journey, and I was ready to live it on my own terms. I was free, and in that freedom, I found a strength, a peace, a love that would carry me forward into a future that was all my own.